Okay, good evening to all of you. Thank you for coming out. Such a special time for us to gather to learn some Torah together. We first of all want to thank our sponsors, Danny and Audrey, Danny and Andrew Walt, who are sponsoring tonight's Torah learning. Lil Nishmas, Daddy's parents, his mother, Hadassah, Bat Binyamin Esther, whose yahrzeit was just, and also Danny's father, Chaim Shlomo ben Naftali Yitzchak Brendel, whose yahrzeit is on Purim itself. So Danny, where are you? There you are. Neshama Shehavan Aliyah, wish you, Audrey, the entire family, only nachas and good things to come. And as well, of course, we're speaking as the Jewish people and the entire world is experiencing historic times. And we know in every historic juncture, it doesn't come without pain and suffering. As we know, today was a very heavy day for Israel. So our learning should also be in the schos, in the merit that our brothers and sisters, those who are in need of a refuah shlema, should have one swiftly. Those who heartbreakingly are in need of a nechama should have one, betoch shar avei Tzion b'Yerushalayim, and that should be the end of it. There should be no more casualties, and we should see a tremendous and unmitigated success for Israel, fighting the very root of evil, Amalek himself. The head of the octopus should be cut off, and it should usher in just a brilliant time for world history, a brilliant time for the Jewish people, be able to live in peace and tranquility. Finally, what we've been waiting for thousands of years. So it should be Yiratzon that this Purim should really, really be a retelling of the story of Purim. Mordechai and Esther fighting Haman, and Haman is killed. He is hanged or hanged, depending on which English literary you speak to. But either one, it should really bring in a time for our people and for the whole world, which is of blessing and of safety and security. Okay, so what I wanted to talk about tonight, which I think is perhaps the untold part of the Megillah. You know, we read the story of the Megillah every year, twice a year. We read Mordechai, we read Esther and Haman and Achashverosh, and we know the story very well. I mean, I think we know the story very well. We review it, we learned it growing up, but there's, in every story, there's like the text and there's the context. What was happening in Jewish history before? What happened as a result of the success of the little bow that happens, that everyone kind of runs away in the horizon and happily ever after? But what happened as a result of the Purim story? And I think if we ask a few questions, we'll ask three questions. The third one, to me, is the most important one. And then through that third question, we'll hopefully see what I like to describe, at least for me, when I realized this concept of the story of Purim, I realized that my whole life, I was looking at Purim as two-dimensional. Once I realized what I'm going to share with you tonight, I saw Purim as a three-dimensional, it was like alive, it was real, it was more relevant, it was more meaningful. And once I came to this realization, I never read or heard the Megillah the same way, and I'm hoping that it has the same effect on you. So let's ask three questions. The first question is like this, okay? Maybe the most basic question out of the three. In source one on the sheets that you have, if you don't have, there should be plenty of copies around. So it tells us something that we may have heard about. We know that chapter 1 of the Megillah talks about the big Seudah, the big feast that Achashverosh hosted. We're told it was the third year of his reign, right? Esther, chapter 1, verse 1, Perak Aleph, Pasuk Aleph, third year of his reign, and he hosted this huge feast, and everyone was invited. Okay, and it's interesting, parenthetically, it's a three-way debate in Masechet Megillah, in the Gemara, where you need to start reading the Megillah from. One opinion says where we do it, and there's two other opinions, either when Haman was appointed, which by the way, the children would have loved that one, because if you've ever tried to bring your kids to the Megillah reading, they're all excited, they have their groggers ready, and at the beginning, it's like very anticlimactic, because it's like two full prakim, and like Haman doesn't appear once. So that would have been the favorite opinion in the Gemara amongst children, that you could just start off with right, that Achashverosh Gidal as Haman, boom, right? It started off with the big, but it's not like that. We start at the beginning. And maybe that opinion that we do is the most least intuitive. Why do we have to hear about the whole ostentatious hullabaloo of Achashverosh's party. Why is that important? Why was that a significant part of the story? And we know that the Gemara tells us, perhaps we know, but the Gemara tells us in Daf Yud Beis Amud Aleph, the first source, that why was it that generation of Shushan, what did they do so wrong that they were, on a divine sense, that they were destined to have such a stirring generation, such a intense time? Of course, we know that the story ended up well, but if you were a Jew living in Shushan, or any of the 127 provinces of the time, it was a very difficult tekufa, very difficult time to be a Jew. It wasn't easy. Okay, at the end, it ended good. It ended well. But we know from the Megillah itself that the whole story of the Megillah Esther took how many years to unfold? Anyone know? Huh? 9. 9 years. Started off on the 3rd year of Achashverosh, and at the end of the Megillah, it tells us that the happy end happened in the 12th year of Achashverosh. So 9 years it took for the whole story to unravel. So during that time, it was a very intense time for the Jewish people. So the Gemara asks us, why was it that Hashem, that God decided to give such an intense time for the Jewish people? And the Gemara tells us why. Mipnei shenehenu misuudaso shel oto rasha. Because they went to join in the party, in the banquet that was described in chapter 1. And that was the cause of all the intensities of Haman having this elevated status and creating this regime and plan. He was the first one ever to think of the final solution. Right? If you think of it, that no other time in Jewish history was there a plan, was there a ratzon to annihilate all the Jewish peoples. Yes, Amalek comes, but it's like stories here and there tucked in Tanakh. Even Paro wanted to kill the boys, but he never tried to kill the girls, never tried to kill the people that were already older, because we were a slave nation. But this happened for the first time in the Purim story and would never really be repeated until the Holocaust under Hitler's rule. And he was Amalek as well. Right? So this was the first. But how come that generation was given such a hard hand to deal with? So the Gemara tells us because they went and they joined the banquet and the party of Achashverosh. Okay? Now between me, you, and the lamppost, or I guess between me, you, and the tripod, because there's no lamppost here, what does that mean? What was so bad? The Gemara tells us all the food was glatt kosher, right? The food, the wine was all kosher. Everything, you didn't have to eat. Everything was. There was even a kosher kitchen, special kosher caterers. Everything was kosher. So what was so bad that? Okay, we understand maybe it wasn't the best thing to do. The king of Persia is hosting a banquet. Maybe it's not the right thing to do. But what was so wrong about it that the cause that the Gemara tells us that the cause of that was this horrible decree that Haman came, rise to power, and the first person in world history to come up with this idea of the final solution to eradicate all the Jews. Minar, Badzakin, Taf, Nashim, young, old, women, children, every Jew has got to go. But why was joining his feast such a bad thing? Okay, that's the first question. We're going to leave that on the back burner. The second question is I want to read to you a piece from the Rambam in the Laws of Megillah, where he doesn't really talk about the halachos, but he talks about an interesting thought of the Purim story. And as you see in source 3, which we won't read inside, but you'll see one line from the Medrash of Mishlei where the Rambam is coming from and how he's not making it up. He's just codifying what we had already in Chazal. And what he says is like this, that there's going to be, we believe, this era of the final redemption, the Messianic era, the final redemption, where the Jewish people will be able to live in the land of Israel, and we believe miracles and wonders are going to be happening at play to allow the Jewish people to all be kibbutz galiot, to come from all kanfos haaretz, all corners of the world, people to live in Israel with peace and tranquility, and the entire world, even the UN. They'll be able to replace the meaning of the UN, which is currently useless nations, and they can then call themselves the United Nations one day, because they'll be making resolutions how to support the security of the Jewish people, and Twitter and Facebook, and Twitter's maybe X now, I'm not sure, and TikTok, everyone will just be talking about how amazing the Jewish people are, l'goyim, and it'll be our responsibility to teach morality, like the prophets described. The Messianic era, the final redemption, and miracles and wonders will be happening to bring about that stage in history. And the Rambam tells us right? By the way, the Rambam was the very pragmatic one. He's doesn't believe in, angelic, flying, magical wonders. He's the pragmatist of all our Rishonim. He tells us that when that time comes, guess what we won't be doing anymore? We won't be sitting down once a year to have the Pesach Seder. We won't be shaking the lulav and esrog anymore the same way that we do now. We might not even be lighting the Hanukkah candles. Because all of our Judaism now that we practice to recall great things of our past will pale in comparison of all the new miracles that we will have to celebrate once we enter that stage in history. With one exception. Guess what that one exception is? Hint, this is a pre-Purim shir, okay? What's that one exception? Purim. He says Purim will still be practiced in the Messianic era. In the age, in the era of final redemption, Purim will not be touched. We're still going to do Mishloach Manas. We're going to still sit for a Su'uda. We're still going to gather to hear the Megillah, of Megillah's Esther, the story of Mordechai and Esther, of Haman and Achashverosh. That will go untouched, okay? And the question is, I think if I would have asked you before I presented this Rambam to you, which is the source 2, and the Medrash that he's quoting essentially from source 3, that he's elaborating from in source 3, I think we all would have picked a different day. Maybe some would have said Pesach, maybe some would have said Hanukkah, maybe some would have, but maybe Shavuos. But I don't think anyone would have come to the conclusion that Purim was going to be the day that is going to last for eternity. That no matter what happens to enter in the final redemption, whatever miracles we've seen already or that we're waiting to see more of, that Purim was the one that wouldn't pale in comparison to everything that we're going to see. So what does that mean? How do we understand Purim in a way which makes sense to us that it's not going to be touched even in the stage of final redemption, in the Messianic era? Okay, those are 2 questions. The third question, I think, is the most important for our discussion, especially as a springboard to the idea that I want to share with you. And the third question is like this. If you think of Purim, and you really analyze it from even a superficial level, you'll notice that it stands alone amongst all these special days that we have. Every other, it sounds like a new paragraph for Manishtana, exactly. For all other days that we have in the year, it orbits the Beit HaMikdash, the Beit HaMikdash. It orbits Yerushalayim, okay? Think of any day. Come on. Give it to me. Any day. Okay, so first of all, the Shalosh Regalim, the Torah does tell us that they are recalling 3 specific things that happen in the desert, in the Midbar. Okay, the Exodus itself, that's Pesach, and standing at Har Sinai, that's Shavuos, and the fact that we had, let's say, the Anani HaKavod, according to one opinion, or Sukkos Mamish, according to Rabbi Akiva, and that's why we have Sukkos. How we traveled in the desert is how Sukkos is commemorated. But every time the Torah tells us about those 3 instances in the desert, it tells us something else about those 3 days also. And it connects those days to very specific moments, agricultural moments that the Jewish people would experience after they get to Israel. There's no agricultural holidays when we're in the desert. There's no agriculture in the desert, right? So it takes those 3 moments in the desert, the Yetziat Mitzrayim, Har Sinai, and the Sukkos, the Anani HaKavod, the clouds of glory. And once we enter in Israel, they get redefined as agricultural phenomenon. And then what happened every time you experience, for example, the Chag HaAsif in Sukkos, in the gathering or the harvest, every time you're a farmer that lives in the Golan Heights, let's say you're in Tzfat, or you live down south in Machtesh Ramon, or you live in Tel Aviv, what do you have to do during these 3 agricultural junctures of the year? You have to go to Yerushalayim. So the Torah, very specifically and consciously, and every single time that it talks about the Shalosh Regalim, the 3 pilgrimage holidays, so of course their birth, their inception were moments of the 40 years of the desert. But then once we crossed the Yarden and entered Israel, they got redefined as agricultural significant moments in the land of Israel that mandated the farmer, in fact everyone, to go to Yerushalayim. So yes, the Shalosh Regalim are orbiting the epicenter of Yerushalayim. Chanukah happened in the second Beis HaMikdash, okay? It got reinstated, Chanukah Zabayis, fine. All the fast days, with exception to Tainus Esther, so that's part of our question over here. But all the other 5 fast days, Yom Kippur, you watch the Kohen Gadol do the very avoda that he only did once a year on Yom Kippur. So that's about the Beis HaMikdash. And the other 4 are all to do with different moments that the enemy sieged the city walls, the enemy breached the old city walls, the enemy went and actually destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, the first and second Beis HaMikdash itself, it's Tisha B'Av, right? So every significant day that we have to tell our boss, I'm not going to be in tomorrow because of this, because of that, everything that we have is all orbiting the Beis HaMikdash, except for one. Which one is it? I'll give you a hint. It's the pre-Purim shir, right? Purim. Purim is the holiday that happens in Shushan Habira. In fact, the Beis HaMikdash doesn't even exist. It's in between the period of the first Beis HaMikdash and second Beis HaMikdash. So it's such a unique holiday in that it doesn't fit in the pattern of any other special day that we have on our entire Jewish calendar. It's unique. So again, why is it so unique? Why was it instated if it doesn't fit the pattern of every other special day that we have in Tanakh? The classic answer to this is that God knew that the Jewish people would unfortunately be in the diaspora for many years. So we needed like a Chag, a day that represented the reality of the diaspora Jews, and that's Purim. Okay, it's a nice answer. I'm not disagreeing with the answer, but I'm going to present to you what I think is a much more compelling approach to this question. Let's take this question and let's hold on to it right now. Let's not put it on the back burner like the other 2. Let's hold on to this question. Okay, so who was the king of the Purim story? We know the king was King Achashverosh. Exactly. Okay, King Achashverosh. King Achashverosh dominates our story, of course. But what we need to appreciate is who was the king just before Achashverosh? And less important for now, but will become very important for us in a moment. Who was the king immediately after Achashverosh? So immediately before Achashverosh, I invite you to look at the first couple Rashis on Megillas Esther. It's clear that right before Achashverosh was a melech called Koresh. Okay, he's a very important figure. We're going to learn a lot about him. After Koresh was Achashverosh, and after Achashverosh was Daryavesh. Okay, these were the kings of Persia. Koresh, Achashverosh, and Daryavesh. When we look at the Megillas Esther and we just start at Perek Aleph and we read through twice a year, we read through the story, there's a Melech, Achashverosh, and he had a Haman who rise to power, wanted to eradicate the Jewish people. Haman was killed, happily ever after. But what was happening before? To really understand the runway, it's a word that we're thinking about now these days, the runway, the on-ramp of the story of Megillah, you have to know what the reign of Koresh was all about. Because he was the tapestry that Achashverosh walked into. And the story of Megillas Esther happened in the wake of the reality of Koresh. So we don't have to look at secular sources or history to find out who Koresh was and what he did. Because there is actually a lot about him in Tanakh. Okay, the first thing that we have about him in Tanakh is in source 4. So the bottom source on the first side of the page. And this is unbelievable. I want to emphasize this because it's extremely profound. This is a pasuk from Yirmiyah. Yirmiyah was one of our great prophets, great Nevi'im. When was Yirmiyah active? So he was the one that foretold the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash. Okay? Did Yirmiyah ever meet Mordechai and Esther? No, because Yirmiyah was killed right after the destruction. So he prophesied through, he told the Jewish people that the destruction was going to happen if they didn't change their ways. And then after the destruction, Yirmiyah Hanavi died. Okay? And he says like this. So now he's talking in Israel, the Beis HaMikdash is still standing, and he was warning the Jews, if you don't change your ways, the following is going to happen. Okay? So, Parak 25, Chaf Hey, Psukim 11 and 12, Yud Aleph and Yud V'haisa kol haaretz hazot lecharva lishama. This whole land, referring to the land of Israel, right, will be desolate, will be in ruins. V'avdu hagoyim ha'ela es melech Bavel shivim shana. And the Babylonian king, right, the Persian Empire came and took the empire away from the Babylonians, but the Babylonian king will come and they will be in control of this land for 70 years. This is before the 70 years started. But Navi Yirmiyah told the Jewish people, if you don't change your ways, for 70 years you'll be kicked out of the land. Non-Jews will be in charge of the land for 70 years, and you won't have a Beis HaMikdash. Okay, V'haya kimulos shivim shana. At the end of 70 years, Efgod al Melech Bavel, I will inspire the king of Bavel. Who is the I? When a Navi is talking, it's referring to Hashem. Yirmiyah is not saying, I personally will do it. He's invisible here. He's talking the name of Hashem. Ve'al hagoyhahu ne'um Hashem es avonam ve'al eretz kazdim v'samti oso l'shimos olam. Okay? After 70 years are over, I will punish the king who took over your land and that nation and the land of the Kasdim for the sins they did, and I will make it a desolation for all of time. That is their empire that came and destroyed the that will destroy the Beis HaMikdash and leave the land of Israel in desolation. The empire that comes in, they will be gone forever. Okay? So he foretells the Jewish people, if you don't change your ways, for 70 years, you will not have sovereignty over the land of Israel. You won't have a Beis HaMikdash. That's what he was describing to the Jewish people. Okay? So, guess who was in charge on year 70? Okay, there's different ways to calculate when the 70 years started. There's a Gemara in Megillah that goes through this. But in year 70, according to some of the calculations, this Melech Koresh, at least according to his calculation, he thought that the 70 years were over. Right? Koresh was the Melech that happened just before Achashverosh. So Koresh was giving permission for the Jewish people to come back from exile. Who was in charge of the land of Israel at the time? Koresh, because Bavel was conquered by Persia, and Melech Koresh of Persia was giving permission of the Jewish people to return to the land of Israel to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. Who was the Jew that was advocating for the return and telling Koresh, hey, the 70 years are over. You did so now, unless you want God to punish you, you should allow the Jews to come back and rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. Who was the Jew who was advocating for the Jewish people? His name was Ezra. Oh, we have a sefer in Tanakh called Sefer Ezra. So guess what we learn a lot about? We learn a lot about this story. Okay? And first we'll read the next source number 5, and then I'll read to you some very similar sources from Ezra that give even more detail. Ubishnas achas leKoresh. The first year of Koresh, the king before Achashverosh, the first year of his reign, the first year, it's like the first executive order that he was signing. What happened? Of course, Melech Pras, Lichlos Dvar Hashem Befi Yirmiyahu. That prophecy that we learned from Sefer Yirmiyah was over. The 70 years was expired. Heir Hashem at Ruach Koresh. God inspired the king of Koresh, Cyrus, Melech Pras. V'ya'aver kol b'chol malchuso. He created these announcements through all his provinces. V'gam michtav lemar, also he put it in writing, and he says, Ko Amar Koresh. This is what the king of Persia is dictating. Melech Pras. Kol mamlachos haaretz nasan li Hashem Elokei Hashemayim. God gave me all this land, all this power. V'hu pekad alai livnos lo bayit b'Yerushalayim asher b'Yehuda. Wow, what a statement. Can you imagine the world leader saying that God gave me this land and I want the children of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah to come back and build a temple in the house of Hashem. Okay, my predecessors, the Babylonians, destroyed the first Beis HaMikdash. Invite them back so they could rebuild their temple. Mi bachem mikol amo Hashem elokav imo v'ya'al. Who is going to hear this call? Melech Koresh is beckoning the Jewish people back to Israel. Whoever is going to listen to the call, heed to my voice, and welcome. Free passports, visas. You can live in Jerusalem, and you'll have building, zoning rights for the Temple Mount, and you could rebuild the second Beis HaMikdash. That was the permission that the Melech Koresh was given. Okay, but not so easy and not so fast. Okay, so the beginning of Ezra, I want to read you. Didn't make it onto the source sheet. It didn't make it on time for my editor, so it didn't make the deadline. Just joking. Okay, but it says, I want you to follow in line though. Follow inside, and the first pasuk that we just read in source 5. Just follow along, and I'm reading not from there. I'm reading from Ezra, Parak 1, pasuk 1, 1. Ubishnas aches lekorish melech pras lichlos devar Hashem mipi Yirmiyahu. Same pasuk, but I'm not reading from your sheet. I'm not reading from Divrei Hayamim. I'm reading from Ezra. Hey Hashem es ruach korish melech pras v'yavar kol b'chol malchus v'gam b'michtav lemar kol korish melech pras kol malchus ha'aretz nas only Hashem. It's the same two psukim. The first two psukim of Ezra are the same psukim that we just read from Divrei Hayamim. Okay, but Ezra continues and he says, and it's all going well. People are listening to him. But there's little signs that it's not going so well, because only 42,000 Jews listened to him and come home from Persia. The Jewish people were way more than 42,000. It was a tiny little sliver of the Jewish people. And who listened to his call? Only the Roshei Ha'avos, the leaders of Yehuda and Binyamin, the Kohanim and the Leviim. But those are the people who listened to Ezra. Everyone else says, Persia's pretty good. We don't necessarily want to leave our homes and our success in Persia, because it's going pretty well for us over here. We don't want to leave to some temple. Our grandparents had a temple, right? This is like 70 years. So their parents would have remembered the concept of a temple, but they were pretty comfortable in Persia. They didn't want to go. Fine. But Jews came, and this is all before Achashverosh. This is in the times of Koresh, the first year of Koresh's reign. And then what happened? We're seeing that it didn't all work so fine and dandy, because Vayihi Am Haaretz, the people of the land, as much as Koresh, the leader, gave the Jews permission to come and rebuild, but the Am Haaretz, the civilians, the public opinion, said no. Merapim Yedei Am Yehuda. They didn't want the Jewish people to come back. What are they, colonizers? I don't know. Who are these Jewish people? We kicked them out. It's better without them. So even though the king was telling them good things and the Jewish people should come back, the people were not so happy about it. Before I tell you more details about that, it's fascinating. So what it describes is there was resistance. The Jewish people didn't quite get it done. And the Navi Chagai, different place in Tanakh, which in the same time, same era, tells the Jewish people that you didn't push hard enough in this moment of this license, this moment of opportunity, criticizes the Jewish people for not pushing through that resistance. But at the end of the day, I want to say the end of the story, and then we're going to fill in the blanks. We're told in the fourth parak, the last pasuk of the fourth parak of Ezra, it says that ba'adayin betelas avidat beit Eloha di Yerushalayim. The whole plan stopped. It came to a halting stop in the times of Koresh. The resistance was too strong. The Jewish people gave up and they stopped the construction. They stopped the zoning, the construction. They stopped coming. It was the deal was off the table. Okay. V'havat batla ad shnat tartain lemalchus daryavesh melech pras. And the project of rebuilding the Beis Hamikdash didn't start up again until the second year of reign of who? Daryavesh. The only king in between when this plan stopped and got re-put on the table is Achashverosh. Ooh, that sounds very compelling. Something we could maybe understand the story of Megillas Esther in a new light. So let's go back to Koresh. So we went from Daryavesh, Achashverosh, now back to Koresh, where Ezra told us that there was a resistance from the Am Haaretz, the locals. They didn't want the Jews to come back. The Medrash in in Esther Rabbah tells us an incredible story about what this resistance looked like. Okay, let's talk about the Megillah for a second. The Megillah, we know there's a scene in the Megillah where Haman is walking through the Chatzar HaMelech, and everyone is bowing down to him except for Mordechai. Mordechai doesn't bow; he goes nuts, and everything goes crazy. So the way we were brought up thinking of Haman is he's an immature guy with a crazy fuse, a fuse of anger, and he had everything going for him. He had everyone bowing down. He got power. He had everything. Because one nudnik, Mordechai, didn't bow down to him, he couldn't sleep at night. He told his wife, "What should I do?" And the way we think of him is some immature maniac, because any other person that we've ever met in our entire life would have been totally fine with that. I mean, he wouldn't have been happy about it, but he's got his Bugattis and Ferraris and his mansion and his power. He had everything. Like, for one Jew wasn't bowing down to him, why did it drive him so berserk? And that's a question we've kind of ignored for our entire upbringing, because we've just parked the character of Haman as this immature maniac who had a short fuse, who couldn't get over this tiny thing. Okay? But it's not true. I mean, possibly. Source 6. The Medrash tells us something incredible. it tells us that why this is on the pasuk that it bothered Haman so much that Mordechai wouldn't bow down. The Medrash tells us about a backstory. Lo lechinam hayu mitkotetim. This, it wasn't you can't understand this Mordechai not bowing down and Haman going crazy in a vacuum. Ela ketata kiduma haita beinehem. There was an old beef, old disagreement between the two years ago, before Achashverosh, in the times of Koresh. Keshahayu Yisrael bonim chomos Yerushalayim. When the Jewish people were building the walls of Jerusalem to have the second base of Mikdash built in those walls, B'yimei Ezra, in the times of Ezra. So who was the king at the time? Koresh, but we've been reading the story of Ezra. That was in the times of Koresh. Bo Aleim Hasonim, the locals, like the Sefer Ezra tells us, and says, Umanu Osam Milivno, and they prevented the Jewish people from building the Beis Hamikdash. This is all we know this from Sefer Ezra. This is no new news. Okay? And Amru Lahem, so the people who disagreed with the Jewish people returning and rebuilding the Beis Hamikdash would go to the king and say, this is a bad idea. And the Jews, Ezra, would say, no, this is a good idea. Bad idea, good idea. So what did the king say? We're going to have a public debate between the two. Each one could choose your lawyers, and whoever wins will sway the king of Koresh one way or another. Okay? And everyone hates the Jews until they've got one call from jail. Then they want to speak to a Jew, right? Best lawyers. Okay? So what do they choose? So every side, the king said, every side, the pro-return side, you could choose your person to speak for your side, and the they'll say anti-Zionist, but the anti-Jews, you could choose whoever you want, and those two people will debate, and we'll see what happens. So Amar Lahem Hasonim, Baro Michem Echad Va'ano Nivro Lanu Echad V'Yelchu V'Yedu L'Melech. Okay, let's each choose our sides. Let's go speak our side to the king. Biru Umos Ha'olam V'Lo Matzu Ish HaMiyuchad B'Rishaso Ki Haman Harasha. Who was their litigator? Who is their lawyer to speak against, let's make the case that the Jews should not return to the land of Israel to rebuild? It was Haman. That was the appointment to speak to Koresh. B'Yisrael Biru Lahem Mordechai. And the Jews chose Mordechai. So here was Haman, years before Achashverosh was ever even a apple in his mother's eye. Right? He wasn't around yet. Koresh was the king. Who was Achashverosh? Achashverosh was maybe the king's son-in-law. He was a nobody. He wasn't around in the palace. And here you have Haman and Mordechai battling it out, the battle of the ages, to see if the Jews should be allowed to come back to Israel to rebuild the second base of Mikdash. And who won? Mordechai won. Medrash continues, Mordechai won. But again, the resistance of the Amharas was too significant. The Jewish people didn't push through. But because of that, Haman had this thorn in his thigh that he hated Mordechai because of what happened years ago. So when he's walking through the Chatzar HaMelech, and everyone's bowing down except for Mordechai, he's not some random Jew who he's never met and he learned about him because he's not bowing down. No, he's Mordechai. He's the guy who has been my arch enemy. About this battle that's been happening for years and years, whether the Jews should have the ability to go back to Israel or stay in exile where Jews belong. And that wasn't good enough for Haman. Haman says, you know how I'm going to beat Mordechai forever in this battle? If the Jews should return or not, I'm going to get rid of the Jews. And then it will be case settled. There will be no debate whether or not the Jews should return or not because they won't exist. And that was Haman's final solution to eradicate the Jews in order to finally beat Mordechai in this battle, whether or not the Jews should be allowed to go back to Israel or not. Okay, so that's an incredible backstory that the Medrash teaches us about. So that's all referenced, or at least hinted to, in the book of Ezra, when we hear that the Am Haaretz Merapim Yedei Am Yehuda, there was this resistance to prevent the Jewish people from coming back to rebuild. Okay, and we know, you skip Achashverosh, and it was the second year, it was the end of Perek Dalet of Ezra tells us, it was the end of the second year of Daryavish that this conversation came up again. Okay, so this is really an incredible look at what was really the context of what happened in the story of Megillah. So when Achashverosh enters the scene, he was just leaving a king who was committed to allowing the Jewish people come back, and by the time that king, Koresh, was finished, because of the local resistance, that plan was killed. That plan was snubbed. Why? According to the Navi Chagai, because the Jewish people didn't take advantage of it enough. They didn't push for it through the resistance enough, and they allowed the opportunity to slip by, and that's where Achashverosh came onto the scene. Achashverosh comes onto the scene. No one's talking about the Jewish people going home. That was already solved and tabled for the time being, or from their perspective, forever. No one was talking about it anymore. The Jews in Persia gave up on that plan. Ezra did his best in trying to get people to go back to tens of thousands. Listened, that wasn't enough, and there was tens of thousands of Jews, 42,000 Jews in Israel. While the story of Megillah was taking place, there was 42,000 Jews in Israel that were living there. They had no purpose anymore. They had no reason why they were in Israel, because the dream of rebuilding the second base of Mikdash was torched, because Koresh didn't allow it, even before he died. So, Melech Achashverosh comes into play, and that's where the story of Megillah exists. Haman wants to kill the Jewish peoples, to really stick it to Mordechai, that you think you won, and you convinced my predecessor, Achashverosh's predecessor, Haman is talking to allow the Jewish people to return. I'm going to show you, I'm going to eradicate the Jews. And Haman gets his elevated status, and he tries to bring out his final solution, but we know how the story goes, and he is unable to, miracles and wonders, allow advocacy and the right people in the right time, and Esther and Mordechai, to bring the Jewish people to safety at the end. What happens as a direct result from the end of the story of the Megillah? Well, we think happily ever after. Nebuch, Esther is still married to Achashverosh. They have a child, according to one of the opinions in Chazal. Daryavesh, the next king, right? There's Koresh, Achashverosh, and Daryavesh. The next king is the child of Esther and Achashverosh. Their child is Daryavesh. So then, Nehemiah, Ezra, they go and they say, you know what, we should rekindle that conversation that we had years back about the Jewish people going back to Israel. What do you think? Daryavesh. This is after the Megillah story, right? Because Esther's married to Achashverosh at the end, and they have a child, Daryavesh. So Daryavesh says, you know what? I don't know. Let me do what I always do when I'm stuck. I'm going to ask my mother. Hey, yes, sweetie. Daryavesh, yes, Ima, I have a question for you. What do you think I should do? And Esther says, Daryavesh, I think you should let this one go. I think you should let the Jewish people return. And that's what happened. The second year of Daryavesh's reign, the Jewish people got this conversation, thanks to Mordechai, thanks to Esther, and the product of that marriage was Daryavesh, that was the king in power, and thanks to all the advocacy, the heroism, the bravery of the story of Esther, the Jewish people got this plan to build the second base of Mikdash to be put back on the table. And it actually happened this time. The Jewish people, because of the intensity of what happened in Persia, and because of what happened, they realized, let's not squander the opportunity that we had in the times of Koresh, because Achashverosh taught us a lesson that we're one phone call away from the wrong person getting into power, i.e. Haman, and then we won't have an existence anymore. So let's go home and let's build on our own autonomy and our own base of Mikdash. And that's what happened immediately after the wake of the Megillah, the next king, Daryavesh. He's the one, Sefer Ezra tells us, he's the one who allowed the Jewish people to finally get the zoning, get the license to live and in Yehuda, in Yerushalayim, and rebuild the second base of Mikdash. I think with this, stunning approach of exactly what was happening, not only in the Megillah Esther, but before and after, the context, not just the text, but the context, we can understand the questions that we started with. What was wrong? What was so wrong with the Jewish people joining the Seudah of Achashverosh? Well, if you notice, there is a time that there's a few times in the Megillah that we read the Megillah tune to the tune of Eicha, okay? And one of those times is that he brought out Kelim Shonim. Kelim Shonim. There's an old joke why we read certain psukim in the tune of Eicha, and the answer is so even the Litvaks could feel some simcha on Purim. That's like an old one. But each one has its explanation. And this one, the Medrash tells us, the Gemara Megillah, Daf Yud Beis, I believe, tells us that those Kelim Shonim were the Klei HaMikdash, were the different vessels that Achashverosh says, okay, my predecessor Koresh, he completely destroyed this plan of the Jewish people returning, so the Jewish people are going to build and live in Persia, so forget about Jerusalem, that's history, that's never going to happen again. He took, because it was part of the Persian Empire, he took all those Kelim, and he put them back in Persia, and he says, Jews, I want you to feel at home here. Here's your menorah. Here's your, he didn't have the Aron, but here's your Shulchan, and here's your Kiyor, and here's your Mizbeach HaZahav. And I want these to be decorations, no longer religious, but decorations around my big Seudah. And the Jewish people joined that party. Arguably, that party was to celebrate the fact that the Jews were no longer had a plan to go back to Yerushalayim. That's what the party was. And the Jewish people went to that to celebrate with Achashverosh. Say, yeah, we're here to stay. Yeah, bring the kelim. We'll celebrate you. We'll eat the kosher meat. It's worse that it's kosher now because that was their new home. They wanted to be in Persia. And the fact that the kelim, the Klei HaMikdash, were present in the background as decorations, that was so damning, that was so negative, that was so severe for the Jewish people to go to such a party. The Gemara tells us that that's what, if you're really giving up and going home, Haman is going to come and remind you that a Jew is never home unless they're in Yerushalayim. And that's exactly the rest of the story of Purim. We asked the second question also. Out of all holidays, Purim was the one that was going to last forever? It's not as special as Pesach, as Shavuot. What does it mean that everything is going to pale in comparison to what's going to happen, the miracles that are ahead of us, that we've perhaps seen some of them? Everything's going to pale in comparison to that, except for Purim. But based on this reading and this understanding of not just the text, but the context, Purim is really the story of the Jewish people coming home. It's the story of the Jewish people entering that stage that it will be so miraculous that everything else that we do will pale in comparison to the new miracles we will have to celebrate. So of course Purim won't be touched, and it will still be practiced even in the quote-unquote messianic era, after the stage of the full redemption, because Purim is that story of the Jewish people. We also asked the question, how come Purim is the only story that doesn't have to do with the Beis HaMikdash? That question seems crazy now, because the way, if you look at Megillah just in a vacuum from the beginning to the end, it has nothing to do with Yerushalayim. But you understand Sefer Ezra, Sefer Chagai, Divrei Hayamim. You understand the context of Purim. It has everything to do with the Beis HaMikdash. It was, the beginning of Purim was this realization and this deep breath that the Jewish people realized we're not going back to Yerushalayim, and that's how it all started. And it ended by realizing through the treachery of Haman that we've got to go back to Yerushalayim. And that's what happened in the tail end of Purim. So Purim has everything to do, just as much as all the other Chagim that we have, the special days and the fast days and everything is all orbiting around Yerushalayim, around the Beis HaMikdash. Purim is no exception. So really, I think this understanding of appreciating not just the text but the context gives a truly sweeping 3D-dimensional understanding of what really Mordechai and Esther were fighting for. They weren't just fighting that the Jewish people shouldn't be killed. It was more than that. It was, where are the Jewish people? Where is our home? And Mordechai realized that the fact that, and right when Achashverosh took office, the Jewish people were just coming to this realization that Yerushalayim, Israel, that was all history. We're done with that. It's never going to happen again. And Haman, unfortunately, needed to awaken the Jews through a very scary time that just wasn't the case. And as Sefer Ezra is very clear, it was a hot topic, a heavy topic in the times of Ezra with Koresh in charge. Achashverosh, when everything shifted, and ultimately at the tail end of the Purim story with Daryavish, right after the Purim story, is Daryavish took office, and that's when the Jewish people ultimately built the sacred Beis HaMikdash, which gave the context for Hanukkah to happen and everything else that we know about. But I think it really shifts and changes our perspective on Purim when we realize that it really is orbiting the Beis HaMikdash and Yerushalayim, and it's really, really something to keep in mind, especially this year when we're seeing history unfold. And we're thinking so much of our brothers and sisters in Israel and their safety, the heroism of our pilots and the IDF. And now we're going into Purim, which is like, in Hanukkah, we at least have like Nes Gadol Haya Sham. Like, we're connecting to Israel. But Purim always was like the diaspora holiday. Like, it's for us over here. Like, we feel disconnected to Israel. But the true story of Purim is probably the most connected story out of any stories that we celebrate year round. It's so connected to the land of Israel because it's the story of distance makes the heart grow fonder. It's specifically because the Jewish people were away, just like we're away right now. And sometimes that distance creates that energy of aguim, of yearning, of wanting to be there. And it's something to keep in mind as we fulfill all the mitzvahs this year, from reading of the Megillah with this perspective in mind, Mishlach Manos, Matanos Le'Evyonim, and the Seudah. We should be sitting and really trying to elicit and feel that yearning that we have for Yerushalayim, the yearning that the generation of Mordechai and Esther did not feel. And that was the whole pain point of, they didn't feel it to the extent that they joined the party that was there to celebrate that the Jews weren't going back to Israel. And for us to feel that yearning, that connection this year, Purim, Tafshin, Pevav, I think is a beautiful way to enter this most beautiful Chag. So wishing you a happy Purim, as they say. You know, on Purim you say Purim Sameach, and on Pesach you say Chag Kosher V'Sameach. So I heard, make sure that your Purim is not so freilich that it's not kosher. Freilich a bit. Make sure it's not so freilich it's not kosher. And then by Pesach we say make sure it's not so kosher that it's no longer freilich. Right? But, with that, I wish us all a beautiful Purim, and we should hear only Yeshuos and Nechamos for all of Am Yisrael.